In October 2025, I joined a company managing thousands of single family homes across the country. And I asked a simple question: how do you track your leasing pipeline? The answer: a Google Sheet. Not as a backup, not as a reporting layer, the actual system. Every lead, every showing, every application. And the thing that surprised me most wasn't the Google Sheet. It was that everyone thought this was normal. This was just the way that things were done. That moment told me everything I needed to know about the rebuild I just walked into. This is year one. I'm Steven Rea, Chief Innovation Officer at Northpoint Asset Management. How do you rebuild a company mid-flight? That's the problem I walked into last October. Thousands of homes in a national footprint, a team doing their best inside of broken systems, and a mandate to fix everything without breaking what still worked. This episode is where it starts. So before I get into what was broken, I need to say something clearly. This is not a story about bad people or incompetence. What I walked into at Northpoint is something I've seen multiple times in my career. A company that grew, survived, and succeeded, but whose systems never quite caught up with their scale. That's normal. That's how companies grow. The problem is when temporary fixes become permanent, when workarounds become the operating model. That's what I found here. Not a company that didn't know what it was doing, but a company operating like a startup that never paused to rebuild its foundation. I think of it as a 20-year startup. So let's start with technology, because that's where the cracks were most visible. On paper, our property management system was AppFolio. It had been implemented a few months before I arrived, and it was technically our system of record. In practice, almost no one actually operated out of it day to day. The business ran on a patchwork of tools layered on top of each other over the years: AppFolio for accounting and record keeping, separate tools for maintenance, inspections, and vendor coordination, Google Sheets for leasing, reporting, and handoffs, Power BI dashboards, attempting to reconcile everything. And by the time I mapped it all out, we were touching more than a dozen systems to run basic workflows. Here's what that meant in practice. If you asked 3 people for current occupancy, you'd get 3 different numbers. Depending on who pulled the data and how it was filtered between AppFolio and Power BI, the answer changed. So no one fully trusted any of the data, ever. We were paying for a modern platform and using it like a filing cabinet. And leasing was the clearest example. Every lead, every showing, every application tracked in a Google Sheet. Not because anyone thought it was ideal, but because it was the system that evolved when nothing else fully worked. Now, I didn't have to ask where the SOPs were. I figured it out by asking how work got done. I'd ask one person how a process worked, and then I'd ask someone else the same question, different answer. Third person, third answer. What existed instead of documentation was a mix of tribal knowledge, old Google Drive folders, an LMS full of long, hard to use content, and a knowledge base built with good intentions, but without operational context. Everything that mattered lived in people's heads. That creates a very specific kind of drag. New hires learn how their trainer or how their supervisor does the job, not how the company does the job. When something breaks, there's no playbook to reference. Every problem starts from zero. It's a credit to the team that the business functioned at all. But that's not a system that scales. That lack of documentation created a second order problem. There was no single way of operating. Each market had its own standards. Each property manager had their own version of good. We had offshore support teams, but usage varied wildly. Some regions leaned on them for everything: renewals, rent collection, leasing, admin work. Others barely spoke to them at all. That meant residents and owners got a different experience depending on which market managed their property. But the deeper cost was internal. When leadership tried to bring groups together to solve problems, the conversation stalled. Every market was operating differently enough that solutions in one place didn't translate to another. It undermined training. It killed new process initiatives before they launched. It shackled the company to whatever had evolved locally over the years. There was no Northpoint way. There were just dozens of local ones. And here's where things get uncomfortable but important. When standards aren't defined, accountability becomes almost impossible. How do you hold someone accountable to expectations that were never written down? How do you separate a system failure from a performance issue when the system itself is undefined? What I found was a culture that had adapted rationally to broken systems. People built workarounds. They figured out how to survive inside the constraints they were given. Some teammates were doing exceptional work, but there was no clear way to see or reward it. And others were struggling, but it wasn't always clear whether the system had failed them first. Clarity isn't punitive. It's how you make fairness possible. Now, my instinct when I joined was to slow down, ask questions, map dependencies, understand why decisions had been made before changing anything. I wasn't surrounded by stupid people. Every workaround existed for a reason. So I asked, I listened, I traced workflows end to end. And then reality intervened. We had reporting failures tied to fragile API connections, a phone system that trapped callers in loops, offshore teams that couldn't flex when volume shifted. Some things had to be fixed immediately. And that's where I made my first real mistakes. The phone system was the first. It was genuinely broken. So I fixed it and did it wrong the first time. Fixed some problems, created new ones, and ultimately had to redo all of that work. Then there was collections. We had delinquency issues, like most companies, and I knew automation could help. So what did I do? I built what I thought was the ideal workflow, a progressive series of automated notifications, tasks generated for property managers automatically to make phone calls and follow up with residents at key moments, and payment restrictions that kicked in progressively. I built it, I launched it at 11:50 p.m. on the first of the month without telling the teams. What I hadn't checked was late fee configs. It varied wildly across properties. For some residents, the entire workflow kicked off and ran in a single day. People were locked out of their ability to pay rent before they were actually even late. The tasks I built for property managers did generate, but no one knew they existed, so they weren't done. The phone calls never happened. I spent the next day manually restoring payment access for dozens of residents. Collections still improved, but only in the narrowest of sense of the word. Rent came in, but more importantly, trust took a hit. Teams were confused, and I created work that never should have existed. And that's the danger of blunt automation. It can move numbers while quietly breaking the system underneath. And here's the part that matters most. If I hadn't caught it immediately, if this had been allowed to linger and normalize, the damage wouldn't have shown up all at once. It would have compounded quietly. More resident confusion, more escalations, more manual exceptions, and most importantly, more erosion of trust between teams and the system they were being asked to rely on. That's how these failures actually grow. Not dramatically, but invisibly. And that one was entirely on me. So here's what that experience reminded me. Nothing broke that couldn't be fixed. Yes, I inconvenienced people. Yes, I created work for myself. By the end of that day, payment access was restored. And we'd surfaced a configuration problem across dozens of properties that we didn't know existed. If I'd waited until everything was perfect, until every late fee was audited, every team was trained, every edge case was mapped, I'd still be waiting. The only way to find out what's actually broken is to move. Not recklessly, but forward. Pilot something. Get it in front of the people who actually do the work. Watch what happens. Fix what breaks. Then do it again. Waiting for perfect conditions is just a slower way to fail. So that's what I walked into. company with real potential, great people, and a foundation that needed to be rebuilt. This series is about talking through the parts of the work we usually clean up after the fact. The rollouts that didn't go as planned, the decisions that don't have clean answers. Not because failure is interesting, but because pretending it doesn't happen makes this work harder than it needs to be. It's a way to compare notes, so fewer of us have to learn the same lessons the hard way. Next episode, the consolidation decision. Why we bet the entire operation on one platform, and what we had to give up to do it. If you're an operator dealing with fragmented systems, missing documentation, or invisible complexity, you'll recognize what's coming. This is the year one, and this is the work.